Okay, I have not published the video yet. I started to do so and then decided that I wanted to add some commentary. And what I'd like to do, or where I would like to start today, is to go back to a point in the essay as I was looking through it again last night. A couple of words came to me or came out rather quickly, and one is the use of the word sameness. So if we look at this paragraph together, I stood by Sally as I had for nearly 3 years now. As always, I stood to her right near the aisle that passed from the back of the chapel to the heart of the sanctuary. Between her and our classmates, all was as it had been, and in the sameness of the moment, what had been was, and what was would be again. Do you recall our conversation about Heidegger and the concept of sameness? All right, let's start there. When Heidegger talks about sameness, it is not exactly a flattering term. We can think of that in the sense of everydayness. There's a poem from Paul Simon from the 1960s that comes to mind. I'm blinded by the light of God and truth and right. I wander in the night without direction. And so I'll continue to pretend. My life will never end, and flowers will never bend with the rainfall. And there's a sense in which, for Heidegger, sameness is the kind of repetition the repeating of the everyday in a kind of mindless, disconnected fashion, which is designed ultimately to dull the senses, to dull one's awareness. And what I mean by sameness in the essay is not that at all. So the essay is dedicated to Julia, and she and I were texting back and forth day before yesterday. And I made the comment to her that in the evening in my study, my orchids and my African violets and a miniature rose that I rescued from death are all there, intentionally there, because only when there is virtually no light can I see their color. It is as though I surround myself in the color of those flowers, those plants. So as I was thinking about what we would talk about today, it struck me that there are many types of sameness. There is the mindlessness of working in a McDonald's. There is the mindlessness of working as a lawyer who does the same thing every day. But it seems to me that there is a very different kind of sameness on the other end of the spectrum. And that's what I would like to begin to explore today. But before I do, am I making sense?
Would this be fair to compare this to like mundane?
Absolutely. And if we think about Heidegger's argument that we are essentially caught between two poles, between Sorg and despair and denial, in order to remain in despair and denial, we have to dull our senses. We have to focus on repetition. We don't really want to feel. We want to cordon ourselves off. But Sorg, if we talk about a conversation we've had multiple times, by definition is other-oriented. It always faces the world. It therefore faces the disclosure that is there all the time. So the phrase that we used last week is that this is standing open and standing in the light of being. So last night, after my conversation with Julia the day before, I sat down with a cup of smoky black Chinese tea, as I often do in the evening, with barely enough light in the room to be able to function, or last night, just a candle. And to my right, the African violets that are a deep bluish purple, and to my left, the orchids that are a deep reddish purple, and a single rose that is both white and red. It's analogous to that moment in the chapel with Sally. It's analogous to that moment at Old Sheldon Church when I was sitting on the ground covered in dirt, completely lost in the experience, essentially realizing that I wasn't there. I wasn't. Time had folded back over itself. So when we talk about, if we go back to a topic we talked about earlier in the semester, we said that to be authentically is to stand open and stand in. We said that standing open and that standing in means that we constantly are in the process of measuring. Of the distance between earth and sky. That when we do that, we once again confront both our thrownness and the angst. So there is a sense in which, moment by moment, I choose to love in a world in which all that is human dies. When we had that conversation, we also said that because of this, there is almost a dynamic being in the world. Because that remeasuring is in fact what time itself is all about. As an aside, you'll remember our conversation about Immanuel Kant. Objects exist in space and time. Space is their relationship to each other. time, their relationship to me. Everybody with me so far? AJ, please feel free to ask questions. You're sort of new to this, so please.
I think my only question or comment was, I remember last time we came here, we talked about the whole market of self-improvement booming. And my opinion, if this is true, and I believe this is true, the constant measuring being you actually being authentic, then wouldn't the other necessarily be false? Because I'm not gonna say there's no self-improvement, but there's never really a time when you're just fully content or fully of knowing, fully of non-measuring, versus the other side of self-improvement. I feel like it's constantly promoting you getting to that state of right there, which I guess really is sameness. So it's like, do you think it's worth mentioning that that is like that they're parallel to each other, or do you think it's worth mentioning to other people that it's not really a true pursuit of self improvement or worth it, honestly? Yeah.
I think you're right on multiple fronts, and I would argue that one of the fundamental flaws in the modern self-improvement movement is that you turn in. And the answer is to turn out. And that's essentially what Heidegger is talking about. When I stand open and stand in the light of being, which is the light of the possibility of my own death, I open myself to the world.
And that was Heidegger, not
Right.
okay.
So fundamentally, the mistake we make in the modern world is we shut off the out and we turn in. And there is nothing there. But when I open to the world, when I stand open and I stand in the light of being, only then can the world disclose itself to me, and only then can I find myself in the world.
So then my next question, and this is probably what you're about to do, is what would be important about Kant's message related to us turning inward if he defines time as a relation to me?
That's right.
Outward, I'm saying, how is it something related to me almost as me turning inward, or is that not what that point is?
Okay, that's a good question. Let's draw a distinction between time and temporality. In the traditional sense of the word, time is an artificial construct. We all meet at 9 o'clock. Every day has 24 hours. When Heidegger talks about temporality, this is me. This is my measuring. This is my taking the world in shape or shaping the world around me. If you think about one of the points we've made is that there is this weird sense of being a part of and apart from. When I take the measure of the distance between earth and sky, I open myself, I become a part of. But in that moment, I also realize that my death is my own. That I am at that point not a part of, I am apart from. So earlier in the semester, when we talked about I and we, it's that same dynamic. At one and the same moment, I am a part of and I am apart from. And to some extent, when we talk about angst, angst is born in my confrontation with death, but angst is nurtured by the sense that I am a part of and yet apart from. the world. We didn't get to it yesterday in philosophy, but I was talking to Kayla Wiggins earlier today, and she brought up the comment I made in philosophy last semester that when we love someone, we are alone together. And that's pretty much what we're talking about here. At the moment that I realize that you are all human, and I decide to engage you in love, I'm also engaging the fact that we are alone together. We can never be one. Our temporality is different. Am I making sense so far? Okay. Good questions. So, when we think about some of the implications for this, then I think I want to argue that sameness has a different side, a different dimension. When I am there at Old Sheldon Church, when I'm standing by the tree to the right, when I place my hand on the bark, I am there again. I'm not yet sure what that means, and hopefully, as we move through the time we have together today, and if not next week, this will make more sense. We've talked about the concept of time, or more precisely, temporality, as a moment when past, present, and future are in some way wrapped around each other or over, such that when I'm at Old Sheldon Church and I place my hand on the bark of the tree, every time I have ever placed my hand on the bark of the tree is there. It is the same.
So, kind of like relativity in a way?
Mm-hmm. Think of, in the West, when we think about time, we think of time in a linear fashion. In world religions, we talk about time in a mythical world as in some shape or form cyclic or nonlinear. So when we step beyond the constructs of linear time, then there is a sense in which past, present, and future are always there. Earlier in the semester, we talked about an English philosopher in the 20th century called Whitehead. He talks about the moment as an actual entity, and he talks about the process by which a moment comes into existence as concrescence. So time, in Whitehead's view of the world, is a process of constantly coming into being and passing out of being, where the moment is so infinitesimally small that it may well be gone before we even know it's there. And I think that what I'm beginning to describe when I talk about sameness is the sense that this moment almost becomes infinite.
The actual present is infinite.
Right.
So does that mean you not believe in a past?
It's there right in that moment. As I was walking around the church, I could literally see every single time I'd been there. I could literally watch myself. Pardon, say that again? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So then could you just say that the memories of your past, present, and the ones that you're currently having looking at confidence and the future, those come together full circle in that moment?
Yes. So, for example, I photographed a model there who I dated for a while. She was there. Julia, the woman to whom the essay was dedicated, strangely, at one point, standing to the right of the church facing the rooms, I could see her next to me. So, in some shape or form, stillness is a different kind of sameness. Whether it's the coming together of all past memories, a radical shift in the concept of time, there is a sense in which the moment is almost infinite. And you may have, to some extent, experienced it. I had coffee with Julie on Friday, and 2 hours passed in what seemed no more than 5 minutes. So when we talk about this kind of sameness, it's a refocusing or a changing of temporality. How I relate to the objects in the world now is fundamentally different.
So then when you say one of your possible points in bringing in sameness in that quote was to let others know that this is possible and not just your experience but others, and saying that now you've introduced this other definition of sameness attached to your memory?
Um, well, let me tell you a little bit about how I write, and hopefully that'll help. And we were going to look at writing this type of essay tomorrow anyway. So we left Savannah. We went to Old Sheldon Church, about 45 minutes. We had already been in Bonaventure Cemetery, and I could feel already a kind of shift. So we get to Old Sheldon Church, get out of the car, I find the nearest bench, I put my camera bag down, pick the camera up, and I can feel the shift. I can feel the tree. So after the experience of feeling Julia stand next to me, getting back in the car and realizing I was filthy, sweaty, covered in mosquito bites. I didn't even feel the mosquito bites. I could see them. The whole incident, I can't say troubled me, but it certainly moved me. So we drove back to Savannah. I washed my hands. I sat down. I wrote this essay. In the stillness I remember was the epilogue to a paper I wrote my last semester at Yale. And the epilogue is about being in the chapel with Sally. I have never used this phrase since that day. So as I sat down and I'm writing and I'm describing where Sally is, all was as it had been, and in the sameness of the moment, and then I stopped. Because I realized that I was using the word sameness in a very different way than I had used it before. I let it go, and I finished writing the essay. Typically, when I write an essay like this, one shot. There might be a couple of changes, very minor, some typos. Typically, this is it. So it comes from a very deep place. And I knew in the 45 minutes going back to Savannah that somewhere this was being processed. So as time has passed, I keep coming back to that moment and to that experience. Number one, I've never been in the stillness and had the sense that anyone was there with me. She clearly was. Two, my son's camera, which is 10 years older than mine, 1971, malfunctioned. He got upset. I slipped out enough to fix his camera, calm him down, and go back in. And typically, once the stillness is disturbed, it's gone. So this was a very different experience. And one of the things that's been on my mind is that as I progressively lose my eyesight, I'm not sure what I'm feeling versus what I'm seeing. So thinking about Coffee with Julia on Friday, there was a point at which I wanted to just put my hands on her face because I couldn't see her. I did not do that. But increasingly, certainly wouldn't have without asking. Can I grope your face?
I know you talked to you last week about how you're gonna ask.
Mm-hmm.
You just didn't get to.
I have a photograph she sent me. I have a rough idea, I think. But
You should ask what can you do more?
I could.
What can be better?
Yes. Okay, we will edit these comments out of the video. So I can't determine how much of it is simply what's happening to me biologically, or whether because of the way I've begun to think about the world, it's changing my perception of the world. But again, reading this essay this morning, sameness was not what Heidegger was talking about. AJ?
Two things. One, I think as you're doing this also, I know you're discussing doing this a lot, but if you ever have the free time, I think this might be a really cool time for you to start maybe like writing series of poems, because I think there's more people that are your age experiencing what you are experiencing that are open to reading things like that and want to feel seen versus people my age that read in general. So I think that might be a really cool thing if maybe after this you start doing and you talk about you losing your sight and what that's like. And then also the last part of the sentence where it says, and what was would be again, are you referring to the thing, to the part that this moment of you feeling like this would be again, or this feeling would come again? Like what are you referring to that would be again?
Great question. In some respects, both. As strange as it seems, given what you all know about my theological beliefs at this point, I went to chapel twice a week with Sally. Every Tuesday and Thursday, we were there together in exactly the same place at exactly the same time. I also knew, as the next paragraph says, as summer tarried not before the chill of autumn and one more semester, Sally and I would never stand here in this place again. I could feel the sadness of time yet to come, that time when she would not be again, she would never again be here in this moment by my side. And that's true. I could feel, and eventually did. I went back to Yale, walked into the chapel, walked up to the pew, and stood there. This is not a prefiguring as much as when time is wrapped and the separation between past and future is no longer rigid but fluid. You can be where you are not, and you can be where you have been at the same moment. And by the way, as I mentioned last week, this time in the chapel was my first experience of stillness. How are we doing? Thoughts? Are we beginning to make sense? Okay. I'm somewhat unusually rattled this morning, and I'm not really sure why. I suspect it has something to do with what we're talking about, but we'll find out, I'm sure. So if we think about the concept of sameness, and we think of it in positive rather than negative terms, what more can we say? What does sameness tell us about what it means to be in the world? Also on my mind a lot of late has been Heidegger's concept of Dasein. And to review what we've been talking about, Dasein, the being that is there. You'll remember that the literal translation is there being, which makes no sense. Dasein, German, coming from two German words, da, meaning there, sein, being. When we've talked about Dasein before, we said that the question we can ask ourselves is, where is Dasein? And this is, you'll recall, where we talked about there-ness. And we said that the there is a function of where we are between birth and death. And if you recall, the last time we talked about this, we said that one of the corollaries of there-ness is that it is always in a state of flux. You'll remember we talked about Heraclitus and why he was so important to Heidegger. And it is because if Dasein is there between its birth and its death, the being that is there is always in flux, always changing, always moving. So we talked about the need to remeasure the distance between earth and sky. And we said that every time we do that, there is a confrontation again with angst and thrownness. One way to think about this is as though it were circular and not linear. Let's look at that. When I discover my thrownness, I experience anxiety, angst. Angst presents a choice. If I choose denial, I end up in despair and sameness. This becomes linear. There is no return. There is no remeasuring. There is no re-engagement. We're done. But if I choose Zorg, it intensifies my experience of thrownness. Because now I love in a world in which all that is human dies. I was also thinking about this last night on one of the orchids, the one I rescued. It is about to give birth to somewhere around a dozen blossoms. And in that moment, there was an intense sense of anticipation. I am not sure what color they will be, and I will not be able to see them until after sunset. But I could also begin to feel the fact that they will begin to die as soon as they are born. In beauty, there is sadness. In sadness, there is beauty. Life is inseparable from death, and death from life. So the other day, when I noticed that the rose had bloomed, it was about 5 o'clock, I knew that its blossom had two different colors, but I couldn't yet see what they were. For a moment, I thought it might have died. And I remember touching it gently and feeling both its life and its death. Okay, great question. Heidegger says that at some point over the course of our life, we discover that we're going to die. And we discover that from the moment of birth, we are already old enough to die. We don't know when, we don't know where, we don't know how, but it is as though we have been thrown, pushed, shoved. Right. Heidegger said that the only fact that we discover in the world is our thrownness towards death. And our reaction to that thrownness is not logical, it's emotional. And that is angst. So, there is a sense in which by definition, to choose Zorg is to engage in a kind of sameness. I look at my orchids, I realize they will die. I confront my mortality. I have to choose to love again in a world in which all that is human dies.
I believe that despair and denial is important to be
Tell me more, please.
in the birth, death. You know how we used to always die in philosophy? I feel like that's important to understand.
Good point.
Because if you choose angst, you're choosing
Yes.
despair and denial.
Yes.
And then that can relate to the accepting element as well.
Yes. Exactly. So, to some extent, where I want to take this at the moment, listening to the comment you just made, is that this kind of alters the concept of poetic dwelling. A.J. Heidegger argued that to choose, we have a choice. Sorry about the bad drawing. Try that again. In that moment, when I discovered my thrownness towards death, love, care, compassion, kindness, empathy. He says that when we choose Sorg, we become the measure of the distance. Between earth and sky. And he calls that dwelling poetically. It is the world emotionally connected to. It is touching the barkness of the bark, feeling the greenness of the grass. Julia mentioned that her favorite flower is a peony. I'm going to have to find some so I can touch them and hold them, because that's really the only way I'm going to be able to experience the color. There's also, if we think about this concept of measuring the distance between earth and sky, one is never done measuring. The measuring is constant. Constant because I'm moving towards my death, but also constant because the world is continuing to disclose itself. And if I'm truly to be open to the disclosure of the world, I have to remeasure. So poetic dwelling is not something I do once and never return to. Poetic dwelling is something I do and return to. Yes. I can't measure the distance between earth and sky once. Both because the world is constantly disclosing itself to me, and every time I open to the disclosure of the world, I am remeasuring. And also because in every moment I am moving further towards my death. Every moment I have to make a decision to despair or to choose love. And every time I choose love, I am implicitly reopening myself to the disclosure of the universe. In that sense, I am when I am most in the sameness. And the stillness is what it is like to be in the sameness.
So truly, there is no backside to this. There's no backside to this graph, because
Right.
death is not on either side. It's just there. It's always there.
That's right.
No, we had a conversation about poetic dwelling. We talked about how the now industry is logical, so like the poetic dwelling, where like we go back to language, the logical language is where we have like poetry that tells us exactly what it's supposed to say, but we need to go back to poetic dwelling, so to be the emotional, circular time kind of thing, where the poetry was art and the poetry had no meaning but to the person who wrote it.
Yep. And you'll recall we said that this is the language which shows, not the language which says. That this is by definition descriptive, and it is a kind of invitation. In much the same way that we said last time, a photograph is a visual invitation to an emotional experience. So back in terms of what we said in philosophy class, to dwell poetically is to love profoundly. And the irony of dwelling poetically is it intensifies the experience of one's death. And now we're back to intimacy in betweenness, neitherness. That paradox of being in a moment that seems to last forever is a kind of intensification of the entire range of human emotion in all of its glory and in all of its pain. So what are we thinking?
Ultimately, I like to make things as transparent as possible to get the most amount of effect. Now, as I get older, I realize that's impossible. You're not going to appease or appeal to everything. But my only other question to you as you're writing these things is, how do you deal with the fact, or have you thought about the point in your argument where somebody may say your ability to think outside like this and to make these type of comparisons is almost a privilege in itself, because in speaking to, being at an HBCU, Black people and stuff like that, they may not want to focus on their sameness, but their differences, because it's what has put us so far maybe behind up into this point.
That's like focusing on diversity instead of inclusivity.
Yeah.
Right. One of the points that we've made earlier was if we focus on diversity, that's true. But if we focus on inclusivity, it's not true.
But then my question again is like, how do you mention that in the beginning of like your book, saying I need you to step out of that diversity way of thinking?
Mm-hmm.
And you have done that already.
Yeah,
Okay.
at least in theory. But you raise another problem that's been on my mind and which we've talked about a little bit. I'll go down that road now, and then I want to try to come back since we've got about 7 or 8 minutes before.
We can wait on this too. I know it's kind of a big question.
Oh no, it's an important one, and part of what I'm also wrestling with is a close friend of mine. I think I copied you on the document. If not, I will send it to you later. He was 13, I was 17. I was his teacher, high school teacher. He said, so exactly what is this you're doing? Is this just a kind of post-Heideggerian phenomenology? And I'm actually really struggling with this. One of the comments I made a few weeks ago is I am not Heideggerian. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. But in a strange way, I see the world as he did. So I am more attempting to appropriate, extend, complete, draw the implications out of what he was saying. I don't know what he would say about the concept of stillness or the concept of sameness, but I would guess that they would fall for him well outside of his experience. But this evening at around 7:30, after dinner is done and my responsibilities are done, I will sit on the couch. The lights will either be off or extremely low, and I will again see purple and burgundy and red. And I will be back in that moment of the intensity of the beauty as I watch those flowers die. In the stillness, I will remember. So when we go back here, I don't know why I did that. Let's reload this. So if we go back to where we were when this comes up, then sameness and stillness would be part of the same experience, part of that moment where earth and sky are measured, are brought together, not just today, but as I've done many times before. And this, I think, is the connection to Nietzsche's concept of the eternal recurrence of the same. He was right. When you become so emotionally in the moment, there is only that moment across all of time.
I mean, isn't that trauma? Almost like how people, I think, study trauma nowadays. They're saying like people are forever in that moment, and that's why. And I think you talked about this too, or like PTSD and stuff. That's almost the same thing.
I would call that a bookmark.
Not stillness.
No.
Because it's not pleasant.
Yeah. I'm in the past and I'm interpreting the present and the future in terms of something horrendous that was done to me.
So stillness is always pleasant.
Right. Stillness is always now. And I think that if we can talk about the two types of sameness.
Oh, yeah, we talked about stillness being calm.
Yes.
Okay. That helps.
Good point.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the stillness is
Trauma is not calm at all. Because I know, like, personally, like, I put myself back exactly where I was when, like, certain traumatic things happen. But I don't feel calm in that moment whatsoever. I don't feel still. I feel like my mind is absolutely on track and, like, spinning everything a day or something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Stillness is always now.
So you would say stillness is almost like an adverb.
Yes.
Stillness is not exactly sameness. Because sameness could be trauma.
Yes. Sameness has, I think what we're coming to is that there are two definitions of sameness. For want of a better term, a negative one, i.e., the result of trauma, despair and denial, the repetition of the ordinary in order to avoid the confrontation with death. But there's a different kind of sameness in which I am always measuring the distance between earth and sky. I am always opening myself and taking through the disclosure of the world. There's a passage here.
So I have a repetition of loving somebody.
You said what?
I asked if there was a repetition of loving somebody. And I don't think, like, that you love somebody differently, like, every single time you post them. I think there are people come to do it towards, like, different people. And so, I would choose someone else as, like, the repetition. In love, because you always said that in loving somebody, you're taking the devil's down, like, you're not staying open, you're not staying alive, and you don't recognize their death or your own, and you can't like them, and you can't experience things.
Exactly. So this is a combination of the last few texts I sent Julia. And time seems to stop, or past, present, and future are simultaneously here, as though folded over itself, and I seem to disappear into the moment, into the bark of the tree, the mortar, the brick, and the green of the grass. I was smiling, calmer than I can remember, lost in the feeling of the light drifting through the draping of the moss. I can feel the grayness of the shadows. All the emotion just enters me. And it was almost as though it was just going right through. Almost as though I was transparent. But the connection to everything was there. So what I would like to do, if this works, and please think about it, is let's come back to this since it's about 10 now. Next time. I'm intrigued by this sense of the cyclic nature of sameness, its relationship to stillness. I'm still not sure that I have a complete grip on that yet. And the other thing, since I don't know whether we'll meet after that until the fall or find a way to talk over the summer, which would be great, is where am I going to start? I don't want people to write me off as just another disciple of Heidegger, because I am not. But when I say that he was my intellectual grandfather, he might as well have been flesh of my flesh. Comments or thoughts?
I have another question actually.
Sure.
So when you were talking about staying open and staying in the water and that allows you to be open to the world when you stand out, and that as people reaching that they can only can be accepted of the world. So would you say, because to get there you have to kind of go through stories. So would you say that if someone is open to the world, but then let's say they experience heartbreak or something happens that makes them scared to be open, and they revert in and go into despair and denial, that like would you say they could become open again in the same way they were before? And that's like the beginning of
Mm-hmm.
13 years of openness.
Mm-hmm.
I think completely placed yourself off. So then you would say during that time period, you were still in pain, and then you found a way to get back to or to open up to it.
Yeah, when my last relationship ended, it felt as though the air had been squeezed out of my lungs. And the connection to the world was clearly broken. So back to the comment about trauma. When we are severely traumatized, if we don't address the trauma, it anchors us in the past. And we view everything that we experience only from that point of view. It happened to me when that relationship ended. I had to claw my way back. So just because we are able to choose Sorg doesn't mean the trial is over. I have to make a decision every day to love again. Every moment. Watching those orchids die, it would be easy to not want to feel their death. But if I do that, I lose my humanity. Thank you. I think this was a really good, very helpful session. Let me stop the recording.